Welcome back. So here we are for our next speaker, Alexandra Siegel from the University of Colorado at Boulder. She's an assistant professor there where she works on social media and politics. We will continue with the topic of hate speech, this time in another context. And I thank you, Alexandra, for being with us. It's quite early, I guess, in Boulder. So thank you for waking up this early, and for letting us learn a little bit more about your work. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much for having me. I wish I could be there in person, maybe someday. This is a project that's joint work with some of my colleagues at NYU's Center for Social Media and Politics. And we actually began this project in 2016, right in the aftermath of Trump getting elected, and our paper was only recently published, which tells you something about how slow publication can be in political science. But I think a lot of the overall takeaways are still relevant today. So the motivation for this project began during Trump's very divisive 2016 campaign, when mainstream media in the United States started reporting a rise in hate speech on mainstream social media platforms and Twitter in particular. And so these types of headlines were very common over the course of Trump's campaign and in the aftermath of his election as well. The idea that hate is on the rise, there's a massive rise in hate speech on Twitter during the presidential election. And so we wanted to take the opportunity to actually test this systematically, to try to get a sense of whether the journalistic narrative actually was borne out in the data as well. And so the main question that we were asking in this paper was, to what extent did online hate speech and white nationalist rhetoric on Twitter increase over the course of Donald Trump's 2016 campaign and in the aftermath of his election? And of course, we were focusing on Twitter because this was the former president's preferred social media platform. And just to give some quick definitions here of what we mean by hate speech in white nationalist language, we define hate speech as bias-motivated, hostile, and malicious language targeted at a person or a group because of their actual or perceived innate characteristics, especially when the group or individual are unnecessarily labeled. And white nationalist rhetoric sometimes has overlap with hate speech, but is a slightly different conceptual idea. And white nationalist rhetoric here refers to rhetoric or content that praises known white nationalist groups, shows excessive pride in the white race, espouses white supremacist or white separatist ideologies, and focuses on the alleged inferiority of non-whites. And so we wanted to try to come up with a way to systematically measure the prevalence of these two types of language on Twitter. And in particular, our kind of expectation in advance, if the journalistic narrative was true, would either be that we might see kind of a sustained increase in this type of language on Twitter from the time that former President Trump began his campaign, continuing after the election, or we might see some kind of level change. Maybe it was something about the election itself that legitimized some of these sort of more extreme rhetoric that prior to this had been kind of relegated to the dark corners of the internet. So this is what we mean by a kind of systematic increase in this language on Twitter, right? That we might see either a linear increase over time or this kind of level change after the election. And you can imagine other patterns as well, but we wanted to see not just brief spikes that equilibrated, but an actual sustained change in the amount of rhetoric over time. And so to show you kind of in practice what these types of hateful tweets tend to look like, I don't necessarily want to read them out loud, given that the language is quite offensive, but the hate speech tweets tend to contain kind of explicit slurs, sometimes more coded language as well, but usually these kind of explicit slurs and sometimes even calls for violence. The white nationalist rhetoric tends to be a bit more subtle, but is still clearly espousing the kind of white nationalist rhetoric according to our definition. So how did we go about measuring this? So we wanted to start with political Twitter, which seemed to be a place where we might expect to see this sort of sustained rise in hate speech if Donald Trump was indeed sort of causing an increase in this sustained language by his election legitimizing some of this more extreme ideology. So we first had a data set of over 150 million tweets referencing Hillary Clinton collected from the time Trump declared his candidacy until about 6 months after he began his term in office. We had a similar data set of over 600 million tweets referencing Donald Trump collected over this same time period. And so these were data sets collected on both the handles of the then candidates and also keywords and hashtags that were relevant to the campaign. So these two data sets together are what we think of as our political Twitter data set. But of course, it's possible that an increase in this kind of extreme language on the platform wasn't just happening in explicitly political discussions. So to try to get at this, we also collected tweets from a large random sample of American Twitter users. So this is a data set of about 400 million tweets sent by a random sample of 500,000 American Twitter users, again, collected over this same time horizon. And the way we identified our random sample was we generated numeric Twitter IDs with a random number generator, and then checked the IDs to ensure that they were actually accounts located in the US. So this is sort of how we compiled this sample. And the idea here is that we take these two kind of large subsets of the American Twitter sphere, one that's explicitly political and one that's a random sample of American Twitter users, to try to understand whether we see increases in hate speech or white nationalist rhetoric over this period under study. Now, our first thought in terms of how to measure this content, because a lot of it is explicit slurs, is to start with dictionary-based methods. But of course, many problems arise when you use this approach. So first of all, a term might be part of a user's Twitter handle rather than a slur being explicitly used. Dictionary-based terms can be part of other words or especially hashtags on Twitter. Dictionary terms could be homonyms, right? So words that are spelled the same but can be used in other ways with different meanings. And counter speech often can include dictionary terms. So something that we see a lot in our data is, for example, in the days after Trump was first elected, people were sort of decrying the use of extreme language in this period. So this is an example of someone denouncing the use of hate speech in the Trump era. So they use explicit slurs, but the tweet itself we would not classify as hate speech. Again, also language evolves very rapidly online. So if we are limiting ourselves to dictionary-based terms, we may miss an important subset of hateful language that comes into more popular use during the period that we're studying. And so our first approach is to begin with a dictionary-based method, but then to use human-coded data to train naive Bayes classifiers to remove false positives. So our dictionary-based method captures a very large universe of tweets containing slurs, but then we need to train classifiers in order to deal with the fact that an approach like this is likely to bring in a lot of false positives. And indeed, in practice, over 50% of the tweets that we identified with our dictionary-based approach were ultimately classified as not hate speech. But as I said earlier, any approach that relies on a dictionary at all, even if we're then going through this second step of classification, may be subject to kind of missing some language that is more subtle or more coded or contains different terms that may not have been in use in prior available dictionaries of hate speech in the US context. So the second approach that we use to try to address this is similar to what's known as a bag of communities approach. And this is a supervised method where basically what we're doing is measuring semantic similarity between tweets in our data set and text from alt-right subreddits. So we can say on any given day, how similar are tweets in our 3 data sets to the content being produced in sort of known areas where hateful language and white nationalist language are commonly used in the US context. And so both of these methods allow us to get at a change over time in the prevalence of either hate speech or white nationalist language, so we can more systematically test this kind of journalistic narrative that hate speech was increasing over the course of Trump's campaign, and especially in the aftermath of his 2016 election. So at first glance, when we take a look at the data, this figure here shows the monthly proportion of classified hate speech tweets across all data sets. So this is using our dictionary-based method where we then train a classifier to remove false positives from the data. And so the blue bars are the Clinton data set, the red bars are the Trump data set, and the green bars are from our random sample. And at first glance, when you take a look at this, 2 things stand out. So one is there doesn't seem to be any kind of sustained pattern or increase over this period of time in the proportion of tweets containing hateful language. And this figure looks very similar if you look at the volume of classified hate speech tweets or the number of unique users producing this content, right? Because we might think even if there isn't a change in the overall prevalence of language, the number of users producing it, for example, might have changed, but we don't see this here. And the one place where we do see this kind of spike is around January and February of 2017 in the Trump data set. And it turns out this spike, which I'll show you later, is actually primarily a spike in misogynistic language. And it occurs for 2 reasons. One is this is around the first time that Hillary Clinton publicly spoke out after losing the election. So there's a barrage of misogynistic content directed at her. And the other thing that happens is former Attorney General Sally Yates tries to stop Trump from implementing his travel ban, and this produces a whole other slew of misogynistic language. But what we see just initially from looking at the raw data doesn't appear to be the kind of sustained increase either over the course of the campaign or in the aftermath of the election that we had initially expected to find based on the journalistic narrative. Another thing that we can do is we can break this down by type of hate speech. So the advantage of our dictionary-based approach is it allows us to split out hate speech directed at African Americans, at immigrants, at Latinos, at Muslims, anti-Semitic language, homophobic language, misogynistic language, right? We can break this down and look at these patterns for each group. So when we zoom in on some of these, this figure shows the proportion of tweets containing anti-Muslim language over this period. And we do see these large spikes, but we don't see evidence of kind of a sustained increase over time. And these spikes, the largest ones are associated with terror attacks, which is pretty common in the literature on kind of anti-Muslim hate speech. And we also do see a spike around the institution of Trump's Muslim ban, right? So it's not to say that nothing related to Trump's behavior might be driving brief increases in hate speech, but we don't see evidence of the sort of sustained increase that we'd expected to find. Similarly, with anti-Semitic language, we see some spikes, but no evidence of kind of a clear upward trend. This large spike in June of 2016 actually corresponds to when Trump tweeted out an anti-Semitic and white nationalist meme. And so again, it's not to say that bursts are not potentially related to his behavior or his online behavior, but we're not seeing this kind of sustained increase. This once again shows the spike in misogynistic language, which was actually driving that larger increase you saw in the graph showing the monthly proportions over time in the beginning. And again, this large spike in late January, early February are tweets primarily directed at Hillary Clinton and Sally Yates expressing misogynistic content. When we look at white nationalist language, this is in our Trump data set. Interestingly, right, we definitely do not see an increase in the aftermath of the election in this type of content. And these patterns look fairly similar across our data sets, and regardless of whether we look at volume or the number or proportion of unique users producing this content. But it's possible, right, again, as I said before, that this is all an artifact of our dictionary-based approach. Maybe even though we put together these large dictionaries based on terms compiled by the Anti-Defamation League, the Racial Slur database, maybe even though we're using these large dictionaries of known terms, we're missing something because the type of language that's used in practice is more subtle, or the terms change too rapidly over time. And so to get at this, as I mentioned before, we use our supervised method where we compare the semantic similarity of tweets in our data set to content produced on alt-right subreddits. And when we do this, we again do not see a sustained increase. So this is the Trump data set, the semantic similarity over time. There doesn't seem to be either an upward trend over the course of the campaign or an increase after the election. Similarly, in the Hillary Clinton data, we don't see this kind of sustained increase, and it's not visible in our random sample data either. And so taken together, the kind of main finding that we illustrate in the paper is that contrary to the sort of received wisdom, our analysis does not show a systematic increase in hate speech over the course of the campaign or in the aftermath of the election. And one thing to note here is because our data was collected in real time, it includes lots of content that is later deleted. So the issue here is not that we're sort of missing tweets that initially appeared but were then taken down by Twitter, which is something that might be a possibility if you were not collecting this sort of real-time data. Again, while we observe sort of spikes in particular types of hate speech, and some of that does seem to be connected to behavior by former President Trump, they quickly dissipate and don't show this kind of systematic increase. In terms of white nationalist rhetoric over time, we see the same thing. We don't see any kind of increase that sustains over the course of the campaign or in the aftermath of the election in any of our three data sets using either of these methods. Now, of course, there's many caveats here, right? So first of all, we're only talking about Twitter and only the portion of Twitter that we are measuring here. However, Twitter was, and before his account was recently suspended, right, the former president's preferred social media platform. And we do have these very large data sets designed to capture both political Twitter, where we expect kind of engagement with Trump to be happening, and a random sample of American Twitter users. The other thing to bear in mind here is our approach to measuring these kind of broad trends doesn't tell us anything about attacks on individuals or their effects. We know that individuals who are targeted on Twitter or other mainstream social media platforms by hate speech have extremely negative experiences that often have kind of severe consequences for them. And we don't capture sort of this on the individual level when we're looking at broad trends over time. Along these lines, we don't see attacks on journalists, right? And in this period, many journalists were receiving hateful attacks on Twitter. And we actually expect that may be one of the things that kind of drove this journalistic narrative about a rise in hate speech over the course of the campaign and in its aftermath. And these attacks are, of course, consequential. But again, when we're looking at these broad trends over time, attacks on individuals are not likely to show up in our data. And once again, we're looking at hate speech on Twitter. This doesn't tell us anything about a potential Trump effect in this period on offline hate-based attacks or threats, or his effect on potentially other platforms as well. And it's useful to recognize, right, that these dynamics may have shifted over the past 4 years. This was a project that we started right in the aftermath of the 2016 election, but now we've kind of had 4 years of Trump in office, during which you could imagine these dynamics might have shifted, and that needs further study as well. So the main takeaways from this project are that social media data makes it very easy to find examples of literally any type of language, political or otherwise. It's very large and it's optimized for search. But evidence of a certain type of language, and even a large amount of that language, doesn't mean that it's increasing over time. And so it's important for us to develop methods to systematically measure long-run trends and have relevant denominators, right? So you want to know not just is a certain type of language increasing, but relative to what? And to really measure this over long enough time horizons to identify trends beyond just these brief spikes that quickly re-equilibrate. And so for future research in this area, we think it's valuable to have multiple data sources. In this case, the way we had both our political data set and our random sample of American Twitter users, and multiple methods. Because even though in the case of capturing hate speech, sometimes dictionary-based methods seem the most interpretable, since people have kind of awareness of the types of slurs that are commonly used, we want to have other sources as well that may allow us to pick up on coded language and to make sure that our findings aren't just the artifact of whatever dictionary we happen to use. And so here we're using this to look at hate speech in a particular period, but you can imagine that a similar method could be applied to lots of other forms of speech, hateful or otherwise. And as today, this kind of question of the role of Trump in inciting hateful language and violence, especially on kind of far-right platforms and non-mainstream platforms, has become more salient, we hope to apply similar methods in those contexts as well to try to get a better understanding of how these dynamics have systematically shifted over time. So thank you so much for having me, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much, Alexandra, for your presentation. Well, you started the project 4 years ago, but it could not have been more timely, right, with regards to the publication and the sharing of the results. So it's great that you are sharing this with us today. My first question would be related actually to that, with the timing of your project. So you actually have some kind of negative results, if you want, right? Because to some extent, we would have expecting some of the things that you are testing to be corroborated by the data, but we do not see it. At the same time, you mentioned that it took a while for the paper to come out. Do you think that negative results are harder to publish in political science, in politics and social media, as in other disciplines?
Yeah, I think that's definitely the case. Anytime you have kind of a null result, even if it's surprising and kind of topical and relevant, I do think it's more difficult to publish. And in this case, especially kind of in the early years of the Trump administration, but continuing onward, a lot of people are sort of looking for findings that confirm their political leanings and their expectations based on the journalistic narrative. And what we really wanted to emphasize here, right, is it's not that this paper shows that there weren't any negative consequences of his actions, either on or offline. It's just that they didn't take the form that we expected based on the narrative that there was some kind of mainstreaming of hate happening on these platforms.
Yes, I see. So I think that your paper and your presentation connects very nicely with the project by Sophie that was presented beforehand, because you actually have information on the targets of hate speech, and you see these kind of spikes. And I was wondering whether you have some kind of meta-narrative when you have an increase in hate speech across different targets. What I had in mind, for instance, are well, the typical economic downturns, for instance. Do you have any kind of ideas? Would you like to elaborate a little bit on this?
Sure. So I think when we're looking at this sort of more explicitly hateful language, we tend to see these really brief spikes that then re-equilibrate quickly. And so in general, it's very hard to map those to kind of broader political or economic trends. It tends to be these really short kind of key events that seem to drive short upticks that then disappear again. And so, for example, anti-Muslim hate speech is often connected to things like terror attacks or speeches that are made by elites that contain kind of anti-Muslim messages or narratives. But it doesn't, in our data at least, it's hard to kind of see the broader trends given that we see these spikes that then go back down to the baseline levels so quickly. But it kind of, in general, what your question highlights is the need for more of these kind of long-range studies that might allow us to better get a sense of the trends over time.
Mm-hmm. So we have a few questions. Luca is asking whether network analysis would reveal that hate speech has increased within certain communities, but not overall, driving further polarization.
I think that's a great question. So from the extent that I've looked at this in this particular data set, the accounts that tend to produce hate speech usually are relatively newer and have fewer followers, but they do tend to be tightly clustered together in networks. And so, this kind of taps into the narrative of kind of echo chambers being highly polarized. And I do think one potential explanation for why we don't see the more systematic increase is also that people who are more regularly using this language may have been migrating to other platforms that have less content moderation and sort of promote this type of content more. So even though we don't see the rise on Twitter and there aren't deleted tweets in our data, it may be that people are kind of systematically moving elsewhere. So that would be something to investigate as well.
There's an incoming question that is related to what you just mentioned by Stephen, who asks, what if you focus on the haters only? Has hate speech become more prevalent among the haters?
Right. So that would be an interesting way to look at it, to just subset to users who were using this speech at all. I mean, what's kind of interesting is, we don't see a change in the number of unique users using this language. So it doesn't seem like new people are entering the conversation for the most part. And if we subset our data to individuals who were tweeting the whole time, we don't see a strong difference. But I think I like this idea that we could zoom in on just the people that were using hateful language initially and see if we get an increase there.
All right. So perhaps the last question that is a little more technical. You had this approach of looking at bag of communities, and Luca is asking, how do you measure semantic similarity between tweets?
Right. So basically, what we're doing here is we used a fast text supervised classifier. And so basically, we first predict which subreddit each comment in our Reddit data was in, and then use these subreddit embeddings to train our classifier on the tweets to then predict basically which community is a tweet more likely to be part of. And we then aggregate this to look so we can see kind of on a daily basis how this changes over time.
All right. So thank you very much, Alexandra, for your time, for getting up so early, for being with us. It was a great pleasure to have you. And we are going now to have a coffee break, and then we will move to our keynote that is going to be held by Rai Gani. So stay tuned for our keynote speech in a short while. Thank you.